Welcome back to Close Up. Former U.S. Attorney General Eric Holder is contemplating a bid for the White House, and he expects to make a decision about running at the end of the year. He did Politics and Eggs on Friday, speaking to the New England Council about his new efforts to end partisan gerrymandering, and he sat down to talk with us after the speech. General Holder, thanks for joining us. First, let's talk about what brings you to New Hampshire, this effort to end partisan gerrymandering. As you said, it's possible we're going to see a blue wave across the country, but that means if you're dealing with Democrats, you're going to have to convince them to willingly kind of give up this power and not redistrict in their own favor. How do you convince people to not act in their own self-interest in this way?
Well, I think in large part this is a Republican problem. We're trying to take power away from Republicans that they illegitimately got in 2011. And so Democrats have to come out and support candidates who will stand for a fair redistricting process in 2021. As I've gone around the country, I've seen people get really enthused about this concept, about this notion that they really had not focused on before. And I think that we're going to be successful at it, and that by 2021 we will have in place sufficient numbers of people who will draw fair lines.
But then how do you convince them not to take it a little bit beyond and create their own advantage?
Right. Yeah, and that's a good question, because this is not an attempt to gerrymander for Democrats. And so what I have said is that I will not be supportive of that. President Obama says that he will not be supportive of that, and that we'll take on Democrats who want to gerrymander. This is not what this effort is all about.
There's a lot that leaves Democrats in shock about the Trump administration. You have a unique perspective because you were the chief law enforcement officer of this country. Do you ever see what's happening in terms of, in particular with Jeff Sessions? And this is kind of an odd question, but do you ever think about putting yourself in his shoes? And what would I be doing right now in this sort of maelstrom of legal and ethical questions?
Yeah, it's a hard thing to imagine. You know, what the president is doing with regard to the Justice Department and the Attorney General is really unprecedented. We've never seen a president talk about the Attorney General in that way, talk about the Justice Department in that way, talk about the FBI in that way. And so it's a hard thing to try to imagine what Jeff Sessions, Rod Rosenstein are going through. My hope is that they will keep uppermost in their minds the protection of the institution and think long-term about what the actions that they take, what the impact of those actions will be long-term. It's a difficult job that they have right now, given what this president has done, and I suspect will do. But I don't envy them that job. But I hope that, as I said, they'll do it well with an eye towards protecting the institutions.
We hear a lot about a quote-unquote constitutional crisis looming. Do you see that unfolding in the coming months here as Robert Mueller wraps up his investigation? Yeah,
I think that it's almost inevitable that we're going to see something that is going to be of significance in terms of a crisis. With constitutional dimension, I don't know, but it seems to me that we almost have two trains heading right at each other. I'm not sure exactly what is going to spark the crisis, but it seems to me that it's almost inevitable.
With what we know now, do you believe the president has obstructed justice?
You know, I think there's a technical obstruction case that you could probably make, but I'm not sure that at this point it's one that you would want to bring. Again, I don't have insight into the evidence that Bob Mueller has acquired, or what he will acquire over the coming months. But I think that at this point you could probably make a technical case in terms of, if you look at the Lester Holt interview, the NBC interview, other things that have occurred. I think there's a technical obstruction case there.
We've seen other presidents in similar situations with special counsels tread very lightly, in terms of what's going on. And as you noted, the president has taken a completely different tack. What's at stake when the president is willing to introduce politics into a legal or judicial proceeding? Because you know that no matter what happens, whatever Robert Mueller brings forward, the president is going to obviously take his position and probably take about a third of the country with him in declaring this an illegitimate attack on himself and his administration.
Yeah, and that is really in some ways, I think, the most dangerous thing. This is not about one man. This is about our nation. This is about our system of justice. And to inject doubt into whether or not career FBI agents, career Justice Department prosecutors, a person like Bob Mueller, whose reputation is just unquestioned. He's a good man, a person of integrity. To cast all of that into doubt for personal reasons is something that is extremely distressing to me. To think that the FBI would be viewed as a political institution, the Justice Department would be viewed as a political institution, when in fact it's not, and cannot be, given the law enforcement power that resides in the FBI and the Justice Department. That has to be seen as they have to be seen as places that use that power in a neutral, unbiased, and non-political way. And the president has really made that job more difficult.
Shifting gears a little bit, a lot of the last week has been absorbed in this media firestorm, if you will, over this tweet that Roseanne put out about Valerie Jarrett. Is there anything we can learn from this at all, or is this just another cultural car wreck that's kind of just distracting us from important topics?
I think that what Valerie said was actually really good. This is a teaching moment, that we should reflect on that, understand the pain that is associated with some of the words that Roseanne used, and try to make ourselves better, try to deal with these long-term, long-lasting issues that still confront us as a nation. It was unfortunate, but I think Valerie handled it with a great deal of class and with a good amount of insight.
Yeah. We're seemingly confronting racism in this country on a much more high-level basis, I guess, for a lack of a better term. What would you counsel people, I guess, as we see this? Obviously that tweet was racist. There's no question about it. But you have people saying, oh, well, it's a fair comparison. I guess it just seems like we entered this parallel universe now where people are claiming that things that are racist are not. How do you sort of untie that knot when we're diverging in our viewpoints so tremendously as Americans?
Yeah, I mean, we should have frank conversations about these issues, about the Roseanne, the Roseanne incident. And to the extent there are people who think that that is not a racist comment, well, they should be allowed to explain why do you think it is not, and give them the space for that. Be generous in that regard, and try to convince people that given the history of African Americans in this nation, given the charged language that she used, that was in fact a racist statement. Now, certain people are going to hold on to whatever their beliefs are, but I believe that a substantial number of people, if you engage them, if you really engage them in significant conversation, and if you do so in a respectful way, they can change their minds.
You're here in New Hampshire, as you noted in your speech here at the Politics and Eggs event before the New England Council. You're thinking about running for president. How does this process work for you?
Well, for me, it's a question of asking myself some questions, asking questions of and having conversations with people in my family, and then making some determinations about whether or not this is something that I want to do. I'm going to work through that whole process, and I think come up with a decision by sometime next year, early next year.
So obviously, if you run, Republicans are going to examine the record. Journalists are going to want to examine the record too. Let's take some of the more controversial things that have gone on. For instance, the IRS investigation. Why didn't you decide to prosecute anyone in relation to that? What went on there in terms of the alleged targeting of Tea Party groups? And we've now seen the IRS actually apologize and admit wrongdoing there.
Right. Yeah, and the question is whether or not there was a criminal sanction that should have been brought. The IRS has apologized, and there were some changes that needed to be made in terms of the way in which programs were administered there. But the question for the Justice Department was whether or not criminal charges should have been brought. And the determination that we made was that there was not sufficient evidence for us to bring criminal charges.
Mm-hmm. Have you talked at all to President Obama about New Hampshire in terms of your process here or anything like that?
I've spoken to the president about a great number of things. I don't really talk about our conversations, though.
Yeah, but in terms of how you make your decision, I guess, does he factor into that at all? I'm sure that having worked for President Obama, you're keen to carry on part of that legacy, I guess would be a safe thing to say. Yeah,
well, I think the Obama years were good ones for the country in terms of saving the economy, the progress that we made on issues that were my responsibility as Attorney General with regard to criminal justice reform, the protection of LGBTQ rights. Yeah, I think we certainly want to carry on the Obama legacy, but there's also the need to be ready for what else we are going to have to confront as a nation. It's just not a a question of restoring the Obama years. It's a question of what are we going to do from 2020 going forward.
Is there an issue right now that no one is talking about that has you concerned? Obviously, the gerrymandering is there, but an implication that arises from that you don't see covered enough out there in the media?
No, I think that one of the silver linings, I think, of the Trump administration is that the media is engaged, the American people are engaged in focusing on issues of civic issues in a way that we, I think, in the past have not really been. And so I think that people are talking about the pulling out of the Paris Climate Accords, talking about pulling back on with regard to our deal with Iran, talking about tariffs and things of that nature, talking about gerrymandering. I think we see a greater involvement, a greater engagement by the American people, and I think, as I said, that might be the silver lining for what is an otherwise pretty bad administration.
All right. Well, Attorney General Eric Holder, we thank you for your time. Will we see you back here, do you think?
Yeah, I'll certainly be coming back, I expect, for the NDRC.
All right. Thanks so much.
Okay, thank you.